This story from Mark's Gospel says more than we might think at first. If you pay attention to its place within the context of Mark's Gospel as a whole, if you look at the details of the words of this text, you start to understand that actually this is a story which is about more than just the healing of Bartimaeus. Contained in this short account is an illustration of what discipleship could be like. We've had some negative examples of that in chapter 10 of Mark. You'll remember the story of the rich man who was invited to become a disciple, but at the cost of all his wealth, and Mark told us he went away sad. And then last time we considered those who had left everything behind, those disciples to follow after Jesus. And then we discovered that even they needed to learn that this following isn't about power and privilege, but about weakness and service. They didn't understand discipleship either. We've had these stories telling us how not to be disciples. And now we come to an example of true discipleship, the kind of person who is ready to follow Jesus along the road. And as seems to be the case normally in Jesus' ministry, we might be surprised by who it is that meets that criteria. So Jesus is leaving the city of Jericho, and he and his followers encounter a blind man, Bartimaeus, who is begging by the side of the road. Now he would probably put his cloak out on the ground and hope for the pity of those who walk by. And somehow he found out that Jesus and his disciples were passing that day, and so he decided now is the time to act. And so he shouted out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." The crowd wasn't happy with this, of course, and they told him basically, "Shut up." But he shouted all the more, and I love that he did. He refused to be silenced. Now the crowd probably thought that they were doing the right thing. This beggar needed to be quiet, and so they tried to shut him down, to silence his voice and to pretend that he's not there. But Bartimaeus isn't willing to miss his chance to speak to Jesus, and so he shouts out all the more. He cries for mercy, and he will call on Jesus for help, and he refuses to be silenced. And his voice is heard. Jesus stops, and he asks for Bartimaeus to be brought to him. And now suddenly the crowd's tune changes, and they say, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." What an interesting story. And I wonder if we were to perhaps place ourselves in this story, if we were to imagine looking through the eyes of one of the characters in this text, which one would it be? I guess our temptation normally is to think that we are kind of the Bartimaeus in this story. We think we are the ones perhaps calling out for Jesus to have mercy. That might be where we go by instinct, and maybe that is actually the case for you. Maybe there are moments in your life today, things that you need to cry out for mercy, that you long for him to stop and to call you to him as well. But maybe also we might want to ask ourselves this question: what if actually we are more like the crowd? What if we are like the ones who tend to silence the voices that call out to Jesus for mercy? The temptation is certainly there for us, particularly for those of us who are church people. We like to keep things orderly. We struggle with unpredictable people and unpredictable things, and We too try and silence the kinds of people who don't usually belong in polite company. You can't talk during the sermon. You shouldn't shout out loud. You don't ask questions that are awkward. You must be polite. But I wonder if Bartimaeus might show us the way. That we must begin to allow those voices to be heard, particularly of those who are far too often ignored. We must learn to accept the discomfort of listening to those who upset us, who perhaps don't have the good manners that we have. Because from them we might just be shown the way of Jesus, an example of discipleship. Jesus hears him, and so he calls for him to be brought before him. And so he stops his journey. He places all of his attention on this blind beggar. And what is Bartimaeus' response to Jesus' invitation? We read that he threw aside his cloak, jumps to his feet, and comes to Jesus. And again, you could so easily miss the importance of what Mark tells us. But Bartimaeus has just done what the rich man couldn't do a few verses before. He threw aside his wealth to be with Jesus. For Bartimaeus, all he had left in the world was his cloak. That cloak was part of the way he made his income. He would lay it out and collect the offerings of those who pass by. But now he throws it aside. He doesn't neatly fold it up and carry it under his arm with him. So what seems to be a minor detail in this story is again an example of discipleship for us. That hearing the call of Jesus, he literally leaves behind everything he has. And I wonder sometimes if we're tempted to think that actually, yeah, I can do the same as that. But I wonder also, perhaps, in real terms, we have too much to throw it aside. Perhaps there is the challenge for us today in this story. And I wonder, do we have so much in our lives that we become deaf to that call of Jesus? Are we, like that rich man, blinded by our wealth? Have our hearts become so entangled, so weighed down by attachments to things, that if Jesus were to call us, we would have a hard time throwing it aside and going to him? As Bartimaeus approaches him, Jesus asks him an interesting question. What do you want me to do for you? I wish we had time to sit with those words for a while, but I just want to explore, maybe just for a moment or two, paying attention to the words that Mark uses around this question of Jesus. Jesus has asked his question, and now Mark says this phrase. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." Notice that Mark doesn't use his name. He has mentioned his name up until this point, and so he knows what his name is, but now he refers to him as the blind man. I think Mark is doing some interesting things here. There's some wordplay going on. The blind man says, "I want to see." In my mind, this question comes up. In what way was Bartimaeus blind? What would healing look like for this man? And why does Jesus need to ask him what he wants? I think the closer we look, that the more we find that this isn't just a simple healing story. Yes, indeed, Jesus does go on to bring healing to this man. He gives him his sight, and we're told that the man's faith has made that healing possible. But in an important way, Bartimaeus already saw better than most. He saw who Jesus was, even without being able to see him with his eyes. We have to remember the words that he used to call on Jesus. He said, "Son of David, have mercy on me." He recognizes him. Throughout Mark's Gospel, there is this running theme of Jesus silencing people who reveal too much too soon about who he is. We call it the Messianic Secret. But here we find Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Son of David." He has seen who Jesus is. And I think that's why Jesus asks him the question, "What do you want me to do for you?" Because Bartimaeus has already seen, he already has faith in Jesus. And as I reflected on those words of Jesus, my mind began to struggle with the idea of healing. Because if we listen to the witness of those with disabilities in the church life, we will soon discover that so much damage has been done with passages like this, where we talk about healing. So much damage has been done by those who assume they know what healing looks like. People who will pray for those with autism to be healed. People praying that someone would be raised up out of their wheelchair. And so on and so on. Oftentimes people will assume they know what healing would look like in someone else's life. And Jesus doesn't do that here. He says, "What do you want me to do for you?" As it happens, this man did want to see again, and he could have asked for something else. He would have still been a very whole human being. And that's why I think we have to be so careful when we read these healing stories in the Bible. We can't allow ourselves to get to a place where we think people are not whole until they are like us. Bartimaeus, once again, is an example of discipleship. He already sees more than anyone else has seen. And so he asks of Jesus whatever he wanted, and he was blessed with the healing he desired. You'll remember on Harvest Sunday we looked at the passage from Matthew's Gospel, and we heard Jesus say these words, "Seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you." Bartimaeus had faith in Jesus before his healing came. And the question we might want to ask ourselves is this: do we? As we cry out for mercy, as we speak to Jesus, as he asks us, "What would you have me do for you?" Do we already have the faith we need before we receive what we ask? And so the story ends with the formerly blind Bartimaeus now leaving everything behind and following Jesus on the road. He has become a new man. No longer is he the blind beggar Bartimaeus, but he is now a disciple of Jesus, a traveller along the road to the cross. And as we go into a new week, as we listen to this story again, may we be challenged and encouraged by Bartimaeus's example. May we be challenged to speak up, or perhaps to let others speak. May we be challenged to lay aside our attachment to the things that would get in our way. And again, challenged to have faith in Jesus, even before we get what we ask for. And perhaps your encouragement for this week is his presence with you on the road. The Jesus who brings healing and joy in abundance. Amen.